And anyway, I want to thank the Tell City Historical Society for inviting me to speak here tonight about my father's experiences as a POW of the Japanese during World War II. I know a lot of you follow me on Facebook. Oh, you can't hear it?
You might have to get a little closer to your mouth.
Turn that push.
First of all,
There you go. Talk into the mic.
okay.
There you go.
All right, a lot of you probably follow me on Facebook, and I posted a lot of stories about my family.
You're going to have to get closer to the mic still.
Make sure turn it up.
No, it's up as loud as it'll go. Get closer.
All right. Most of you know the stories I posted about my family. Our family has a long experience of serving our country, and we've been involved in almost every war this country's been involved in. And I had like three great-great-grandfathers that fought in the Revolutionary War, and their names are John Howe, Richard Ashcraft, and William Elder, and several people in this county are related to those three men, and some of you probably here tonight are related to them. And also you probably read the story about my great-great-grandfather, Christian Saalman, that was captured in the Battle of Chickamauga during the Civil War, and later died in the Confederate hell camp of Andersonville Prison in 1864. And if you ever go to Andersonville, they have his pipe on display in the museum there. Also, I had another great-great-grandfather that fought the Civil War, John Weldon Hardesty, and some of you probably related to him here too. But he was in the 81st Kentucky Cavalry on the Union side, and he was in Sherman's March to the Sea. Plus, I had another great-great-uncle that was in the Civil War. He lost his leg at Chickamauga. His name was Michael Sprinkle. And anyway, after he recuperated and on crutches, he walked and carried a cannonball all the way back here to Perry County as a remembrance of his war injury. And my sister, sitting back here, Mary, has that cannonball in her collection. I also had a great uncle that was an aviation pioneer in World War I, Joel Reed from Mount Pleasant, Indiana. He later became a famous stunt flyer out west. He was a friend of Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. Plus, he bought a plane from Lindbergh that he flew people on their honeymoons to Mexico City. It was aptly called the Romancer. And later, he became postmaster of Oklahoma. And then you probably also heard the story about my mother. She was also a World War II veteran. She was an Army nurse and served on the front lines of the Battle of the Bulge. And later, she was with the British Armored Division when they liberated the notorious Belsen-Bergen concentration camp, the same camp where Anne Frank perished. And she saw some very horrible atrocities in that camp. And also I had two uncles, Nolan and Marion Saalman, that were World War II U.S. Navy veterans. And I and my brothers, Cody, Jim, Mark, and Richard, were also Vietnam era veterans. And also my brother-in-laws, David Alexander, Kenny Flamion, Terry Mullis, and Ronnie Rourke were also Vietnam veterans. And you probably also heard the story about my niece. She's our latest war hero, Sally Saalman Mosby. She was injured by a suicide bomber in Fallujah, Iraq in 2006. And her story was in the New York Times and several magazines across the country. And the U.S. government considered that day the most deadly day for women ever in the U.S. military. And her sister, Kelly Saalman Latini, and her husband, Justin, they were both in the military too, serving during this time. And also I also had two cousins right now that are in the military, serving in two bases across the United States. So our family legacy of military involvement continues on. Now, tonight I'm going to read a text of a speech that my father gave to the veterans at the American Legion in Ferdinand, Indiana in 1979. And I was very lucky to come by this speech. I was informed by Shirley, let's see, I can't remember her name. Shirley Gailey, and her husband was the late Warren Gailey. He was a U.S. Navy veteran and Coast Guard veteran during World War II, and he also served during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Plus, he was a half-brother to my grandfather, my dad's father. And she informed me at the time that her son, her oldest son, had recorded this speech at Ferdinand, but her other son had possession of it in Iraq or Afghanistan. And he played this talk to these his soldiers before they went out on patrol to give them courage. Now, I was going to play that audio here tonight, but parts of it you couldn't understand what he was saying. There was so much crowd noise and all that, so I thought it was best just to copy it down and write it out myself and then read the whole thing. And the thing is, I left out about the first 20 minutes of it because it was mostly preparing his audience for what he was going to say and a few jokes that he told. Now, another thing I got to tell you before I begin, when I was recording this, I hadn't heard these stories for years since I was a young man. And when I was recording and listening to it, I became very emotional. I broke out crying a few times, and I may do it tonight. And if I do, please forgive me for when it happens. I'll try to recoup and continue on from there. Oh, yeah, I wanted to show you another thing here. This is a map of the Philippines, and here's the island. Here's where Manila is, and the island of Corregidor is right in the front of the bay of Manila, where Manila Bay is. Here's a close-up of it, and there was a huge tunnel called the Malenta Tunnel that was constructed about 10 years before World War II. They kept ammunition and all kinds of supplies. There was like a little hospital in it. But the last stand of Corregidor, they all were in that tunnel fighting the Japanese. And anyway, here's the Bataan Peninsula. And when they were captured them the first time at Bataan, they had called the Bataan Death March. And they walked, some of them went all the way up about this far to a place called Camp O'Donnell. It's about 120 miles. And they wouldn't let them drink water or anything. They couldn't have any food, no matter what. And then later, after he was captured, he was sent on a ship to this island of Mindanao, a Davao prison colony. And it was back 100 miles north out in the middle of the jungle there. So I just wanted to show you where these places are before I begin this talk. All right, now I'm going to begin with about 20 minutes later. All right, back in the 1930s, when World War II had its beginnings, the United States became a pacifist nation. We took our battleships that we had out in the ocean and sunk them. We disbanded our army. And actually in 1932, the Army of the United States was only 3 times larger than the police force in New York City. Now here we were, a country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and one of the freest countries in the world with a military force that could do nothing. And we didn't. It's no wonder that people like Adolf Hitler, Tojo, and Benito Mussolini, those who were greedy with power, hungry for power, saw their opportunity and took advantage of it. If this country had kept a strong military force back through all the 1930s, we would have never had World War II. They wouldn't have acted. They wouldn't have been too afraid to. If that happened, all those billions of dollars that was spent to fight World War II would have been utilized for something more important and more beneficial to mankind, but it wasn't. Just think of the lives that could have been saved if we would have kept our country strong. I was one of the unfortunate individuals who helped pay the price for that unpreparedness. I was in the Philippines quite some time before World War II began. I was young. I was ignorant. I was more adventurous than anything else. I thought this would be a good chance for me to see some excitement and my share of it before I had my share of it before it was all over. Little did I realize how unprepared we were. So when war began, we had plans of what we were going to happen in case the Japanese attacked the Philippines. These plans were drawn up as early as 1936 by General Douglas MacArthur. The plan was just exactly what we followed. The only thing wrong, plans don't always work out. The plan was that if we could hold out for 6 weeks in the Philippines, help would arrive in time to save our hides. But little we realized at the time, the United States Navy was going to be completely sunk at Pearl Harbor, and there would not be enough ships to get safely through with any troops or any supplies to the Philippines. So as a result, that help had not arrived. Now the situation in the Philippines was like this. We were to hold for 6 weeks. The Japanese made their invasion, and their plan was to take us in 3 weeks. Neither one worked out. We held out for 5 months. This hurt their feelings. Now I'm going to talk a little harsh about the Japanese. I want to tell you this before I say too much. I have forgiven them, but I have not forgotten. There are some who may question why you're telling this story. We are at peace. The Japanese have changed their attitude. They are a peaceful nation, and that's just fine. But the Japanese government has never apologized to any of us or to our government for what happened to the troops who were in the Philippines, and until they do, I will keep telling this story. I think people should know it, and I'm not ashamed to tell it. I'm glad to tell it, but I still want you to know I have forgiven them. Now to begin with, we held out longer than they expected, and this upset their whole plan in the Far East. They did have plans, and this has come to light in recent years. They had plans of taking Australia. This was their next step. They had already taken Singapore, Hong Kong, and Java. They had already taken some of the islands around us, between us and Australia, but there was only one place left, and that was the Philippines. And thinking they could just go through us quickly and get on their way to Australia, they started landing within a few days after Pearl Harbor. And 5 minutes later, they were still bogged down. Now, we had no equipment compared to them. The equipment that we were using was World War I equipment. We had one regiment that was armed with M1 rifles. That's the latest rifle we had. Our helmets were all World War I helmets. Everything else we had were of World War I vintage. We did not have enough metals to obtain supplies for a prolonged siege. We had just stockpiled enough in the Philippines for what the plan called for, and that was 6 weeks. The plan was for us to withdraw from and get out of Manila, retire from that open city, and withdraw to a peninsula called Bataan, and that's what we did. And we took enough food and supplies, which was all we had, to last another 6 weeks. Well, you can see the predicament we were in. After about 2 months, 3 months went by, with insufficient food, insufficient medical supplies, and insufficiencies of everything you can think of. And frankly, we had to set out foraging parties to find whatever they could find that was edible. This included monkeys, dogs, cats, rats, lizards, grasshoppers, frogs, worms, and it even included snakes. The 26th Cavalry that we had with us included their horses. And it was the last horse cavalry this unit this country ever had. And I hate to say that I helped eat it. You know, this may sound terrible, but your stomach sort of rebels at eating monkey, especially after it's skinned. It looked almost like a little baby being put in a pot. When you have nothing else, that's what you had. We were on half rations for a long time. Then we got down to 1/3 rations. Now, most of you know what a military ration is. It's a supply you normally eat. And you get down where you eat just half that. Then you get down where you eat 1/3 of it. And then we got down to where we only had 1/6 of it. Many of us fell sick. We were suffering from malaria and with raging fevers. These men fought on with dysentery, dengue fever, tropical ulcers, and many other diseases became prevalent. And we often wondered which was going to get us first, the disease or the Japs. We had no medicine. Our quinine supply was the only thing we had at the time for malaria, but it had disappeared. It was gone. Men were losing weight and strength daily, and many were so weak that they could hardly walk. And in delirium, you still stood in your foxhole and fought a battle with 100 to 101 degree fever all day long, being very sick. But we had to do it. How we managed to do it, I don't know, but we did. All this time, we were continuously expecting help from the United States, but none ever come. It was at this time we heard the Japanese submarines had shelled the west coast of the United States. With a little irony and a sense of humor, we sent a message to the American people, asking them to hold out as long as they could or until we could come and help them. The organization which I belonged to was the 57th Infantry Philippine Scouts. It was all Filipino scouts, some of the best seasoned troops that were there. And we were used as shock troops in the same way like in Vietnam, how the Green Berets were used. We were continuously being pulled from one place to another. Wherever the Japanese would break through our lines, we would dig in and take our place and move them out, push them out. For 5 months, we were able to do it, but it took a heavy toll, especially for being a white person assigned to the Philippines. We stood out like a sore thumb, and our losses amongst the officer personnel was very heavy. It makes you shudder a little bit, like when sitting on a big bank during a lull in the fighting. 3 of you sitting together, and all at once, the one in the middle, his head is blown off, and blood starts pouring out of his neck hole. And it's very discouraging when in one day's time, when seeing the number of company commanders' casualties, there were 4 companies in my battalion, and 3 of them were killed, and I was company commander. But I have always acknowledged since then, I have found somewhat feelings, like when your time comes, it will come, and not before. Finally, the Japanese decided they had lost too much face already, so they moved in fresh troops and artillery units, which they had used to take Singapore. They concentrated 100 batteries of large artillery, ranging from field guns to heavy siege guns, plus large flights of dive bombers, and began one of the heaviest, bloodiest artillery concentrations in our line that the world has ever known up to that time. It was estimated from 25 to 35,000 shells per minute were blasting our line. This was in addition to hundreds of bombs that were being rained on us from their planes. This was a continuous roar of artillery and droves of dive bombers. Organizations suffered as much as 85% casualties, and many were wiped out to nearly the last man. The last lines of Bataan were wavered, and a defeated American army was in the making. Then with an onrush of hundreds of tanks and 4 months battle behind them, tired, sick, and hungry, the lines of Bataan were broken. There is nothing more pitiful or disgusting than to see a beaten, defeated army in retreat. Finally, after 8 days of these heavy assaults, Bataan was forced to surrender. The end had come. It had to. There was no way around it. We didn't know what it was going to be like. I'm afraid if we did, not too many of us were equipped for what we were going to suffer. I don't know what we would have done, but we would have done something else. The surrender of Bataan was on April 8th, 1942. We were starting to be rounded up. All our weapons were destroyed. The Japanese came through and searched us, took our money, our billfolds, our pictures, and everything we had, anything of value, our watches and rings and whatnot, and we were lined up and started on a march. Then the real fight for life began. We thought we had seen a hard time at Bataan, but that was child's play for what we were about to face. We were assembled together, and the infamous death march out of Bataan began. Part of them marched 60 miles, part of them marched 80 miles, and part of them marched altogether 120 miles to a little town of Barbelas in a place called Camp O'Donnell. No food or water was given us. The march itself lasted 12 days. Now myself, I was only on it for about 2 days and escaped because that's all I could take. There has been a book written by a man by the name of Donald Knox called The Bataan Death March. It's a paperback and it doesn't cost much, but the stories that you read there will give you an idea of what it was like. And here is some sampling of what I saw. For example, in one whole day, I was on a path. I never had a drink of water. Water was running on both sides of the road, and there wasn't a drop to drink. If you stepped out of line and took a drink of water, you were either shot or beheaded. If you passed out just fainting, thirst or whatnot, you were shot. If you fell off to the wayside, and a squad of Japanese soldiers came up behind you, and they would stick a bayonet through you, usually up your rectum, and just went off and let you lay. Now, it was one of the most miserable situations that mankind could endure. On the evening of the second day, I crawled out in company with another major, a friend of mine. It being dark, we headed to the jungle. We went into the jungle and headed back south from where we started.